From the moment a young George Ivan Van Morrison first heard Ray Charles on the American Forces Network, something irreversible stirred in his soul. It wasn't merely inspiration, it was an awakening, a collision between a boy from post-war Belfast and the raw, transcendent sound of Black American music. That day, something rewired in his musical DNA. Morrison would never be the same again. Growing up in the grey industrial streets of East Belfast, Van lived in a world where hope often came through melody. His father, George Morrison, wasn't a musician, but he possessed something even more powerful: one of the finest collections of American jazz, blues, and folk records in Northern Ireland. In that home filled with spinning vinyl and crackling radio waves, Van discovered his teachers, artists who didn't know his name, yet shaped his destiny. And none shaped him more profoundly than Ray Charles. Ray Charles's voice, Morrison would later recall, was not simply a sound, it was a revelation. It wasn't just music, it was truth, pain, joy, and redemption, all compressed into a single human cry. With Ray, Morrison once said, the word soul comes to mind. But to Morrison, that word didn't mean showmanship or style. It meant feeling. It meant being utterly honest. It meant singing the life you've lived, and living the song you sing. What Ray Charles offered Morrison was a blueprint for emotional authenticity. When Charles fused gospel fervor with the sensual freedom of R&B and the improvisation of jazz, he wasn't just creating a new sound, he was dismantling musical boundaries. His 1962 masterpiece Modern Sounds in Country and Western Music wasn't merely a genre experiment, it was an act of liberation. For Morrison, listening to Ray was like watching walls crumble. He saw how emotion could dissolve categories, how truth could flow through any rhythm. That idea, that feeling mattered more than form, became the heartbeat of Morrison's own work. It guided him through the creation of mythic, timeless records like Astral Weeks and Moondance, albums that defied genre, floating between folk, jazz, blues, and mysticism. Yet for all the inspiration Ray Charles provided, he also cast a long shadow. The depth of his artistry, his technical perfection, and his fearless honesty, they left Morrison both enlightened and haunted. The bar, he realized, had been set at dizzying heights. To reach that summit, he needed not only soul but command. He needed his own fire. It was around this time that Morrison found another guiding spirit, one who balanced that fire with earth: John Lee Hooker. If Ray Charles represented transcendence, Hooker embodied the ground, the dirt, the rhythm, the pulse. Hooker's music was not about precision or sophistication. It was about feel, repetition, and hypnosis. Listening to Hooker was like stepping into a trance. His guitar was minimal, but it moved mountains. Morrison first encountered Hooker's gravelly voice through his father's records. The sound was primal, a man talking directly to the earth, summoning ghosts with his foot tapping against the floorboards. Years later, Morrison would transform that early awe into friendship, even recording the Grammy-winning Don't Look Back with Hooker himself. Hooker was primal, Morrison said in a 1995 interview. He could get more out of one chord than most singers get out of a whole symphony. That lesson struck Morrison deeply. It taught him that what moves people isn't complexity, it's connection. That the groove, the vamp, the mantra could be more spiritual than any chord progression. Hooker's simplicity became Morrison's strength. It emboldened him to trust his instincts, to let the rhythm carry the spirit rather than trying to control it. But this freedom came with a new challenge. Morrison was now walking a tightrope between the instinctive and the structured, between the improvisational flow he admired and the expectations of commercial record labels that demanded conventional songwriting. The question loomed: could he channel his wild, spontaneous spirit into something the world could still understand? The answer, or at least a hint of it, came through another master, Sam Cooke. If Hooker represented the earth, Cooke represented the sky. Sam Cooke's voice was pure silk, effortless yet deeply human, gliding between heaven and heartbreak. He was gospel and pop, sacred and secular, a bridge between the church pew and the jukebox. Morrison often said that Cooke could sing like a bird but still sound like a man. In that paradox lay Cooke's genius, and Morrison's fascination. Cooke's phrasing, his melodic phrasing that caressed rather than attacked, became a revelation for Morrison. Songs like A Change Is Gonna Come and You Send Me taught him that vulnerability wasn't weakness. That a singer could be gentle and still strike like thunder. Inspired, Morrison began to refine his own approach to melody and tone. You can hear Cook's influence echoing softly in Crazy Love and Into the Mystic, those tender moments where Morrison's gravel turns to velvet, where strength meets surrender. But even here, the lesson came with tension. Sam Cooke had mastered the balance between soul and success, but could Morrison do the same? Could he maintain authenticity while chasing a broader audience? The risk of diluting his intensity for commercial appeal was real. And for an artist so deeply wedded to emotional truth, compromise was a bitter pill. It was in this creative struggle that another voice called out to him, one filled with fire and freedom, Jackie Wilson. Wilson was the ultimate performer, a man who turned music into motion, voice into celebration. If Cooke was the angel, Wilson was the lightning bolt. His songs, Reet Petite, Lonely Teardrops, Higher and Higher, exploded with joy, with pure, contagious energy. Morrison adored Wilson not only for his voice but for his spirit. Jackie didn't just sing the song, Morrison told Rolling Stone in 1978. He lived it, every note. That was the key, to live the song. To embody it so completely that the line between artist and art vanished. Morrison's tribute song, Jackie Wilson said, "I'm in heaven when you smile," wasn't just homage, it was gratitude. Gratitude for the revelation that music could be joyous, that transcendence didn't have to be solemn. Yet, as always, joy came with conflict. Morrison, naturally introspective and spiritual, worried that too much exuberance might make him appear shallow. His songs often leaned toward the mystical, the reflective, the quest for divine connection. But Wilson's exuberance reminded him that spirituality could also be celebration, that there was holiness in joy, too. That tension between solemnity and celebration became one of Morrison's lifelong balancing acts, running through albums like St. Dominic's Preview and Tupelo Honey. But every artist eventually returns to their roots, to the foundation beneath all inspiration. For Morrison, that grounding came from the rough-hewn blues of Huddie Ledbetter, better known as Lead Belly. Lead Belly wasn't glamorous or polished, he was real. His songs, Goodnight Irene and Midnight Special, were soaked in the sweat and sorrow of real life. Songs about people who worked, loved, and lost. Morrison, who often painted his lyrics with mystical brushstrokes, found in Lead Belly a reminder that truth doesn't need adornment. Lead Belly wasn't trying to impress anyone, Morrison once told the BBC. He just told you how it was. That directness spoke to Morrison's soul. It taught him that poetry can live in everyday speech, that meaning can hide in the simplest phrase. He began to weave that same plain-spoken beauty into his own storytelling, turning the streets of Belfast and the quiet corners of memory into songs of universal resonance. But with this admiration came a moral challenge, one that haunted many white artists inspired by black musical traditions. Could Morrison, an Irishman from Belfast, authentically channel these sounds without being accused of imitation or appropriation? It was a delicate line to walk, and few artists navigated it with grace. Morrison didn't want to borrow, he wanted to belong. He didn't seek to copy, he sought to converse. And it was through another towering influence, Solomon Burke, that he began to understand how. Solomon Burke, the self-proclaimed king of rock and soul, was a force of nature, a man whose presence could fill a room before he even sang a note. Burke's music was gospel wrapped in rhythm and blues, his sermons set to song. Morrison admired not just his voice but his authority, that commanding presence that made every lyric feel like scripture. He carried the weight of the whole congregation in his throat, Morrison once said. When they met backstage at a London concert in the early 1970s, Morrison saw in Burke not just an idol but a living embodiment of what music could be, sacred and secular, powerful and human. He was a preacher who could rock you and then redeem you, Morrison would later quip. Through Burke, Morrison saw a model of how to honor tradition without imitating it, how to let those influences flow through his own Irish lens, his own mystical temperament, and emerge as something uniquely his. But even this revelation brought him back to a familiar truth, that every artist lives in tension with their heroes. For Van Morrison, those heroes, Ray Charles, John Lee Hooker, Sam Cooke, Jackie Wilson, Lead Belly, Solomon Burke, were not just influences. They were mirrors. Each reflected a part of his soul back to him. From Ray he learned honesty, from Hooker, instinct, from Cooke, grace, from Wilson, joy, from Lead Belly, truth, and from Burke, authority. Together, they formed the choir that still echoes in Morrison's music, a chorus of spirits guiding him through the endless search for authenticity. His songs, from Gloria to Days Like This, From Moondance to Into the Mystic, carry fragments of each of them, stitched into the fabric of his sound, reimagined through his own mystic Celtic heart. Van Morrison's journey is not just a story of influence. It's the story of transformation, of how a boy from Belfast found his voice by listening deeply to others. How he carried those voices across oceans and time, not to imitate them, but to continue their conversation. In doing so, he became part of a lineage, a chain of feeling that stretches from the Delta to Dublin, from the church choir to the jazz club, from pain to transcendence. In the end, Morrison once said, "Music is spiritual, it's not entertainment." And perhaps that is his greatest inheritance from the legends who shaped him. The belief that music is not about fame or perfection, but about communion, between artist and listener, between past and present, between soul and sound. Ray Charles gave him the courage to feel. John Lee Hooker gave him the rhythm to move. Sam Cooke gave him the melody to soar. Jackie Wilson gave him the joy to celebrate. Lead Belly gave him the words to tell the truth. And Solomon Burke gave him the faith to believe that all of it mattered. These were not just influences, they were sacred encounters. Together, they taught Van Morrison the timeless secret that still lives in his music today. That the truest songs are not written, they are lived.